This week, we've got Allie Mellen from Forrester to discuss XDR. Then Vincent Burke from Riverbed joins us to talk about the importance of network visibility. Finally, in the enterprise security news, at least a dozen cybersecurity companies announced raises totaling more than $900 million just in the past week. Not even going to try and name them individually. Permira proposes to take Mimecast private for $5.8 billion. That's a big one. The leader of a Swiss tech company is accused of selling access to text message data for surveillance. A former Ubiquiti developer was behind the big breach announced earlier this year. He unsuccessfully tried to extort his employer. SentinelOne tries to bring mobile security back. Google and Trail of Bits team up to release a tool that scans for vulnerable Python packages. CISA has assembled a panel that will begin making cybersecurity recommendations. Make sure to stick around for this week's Spicy Take and this week's Squirrel Story. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
People require access from anywhere to resources everywhere, but legacy security is ill-equipped for today's hybrid organization. AppGate SDP delivers zero-trust network access for hybrid workforces and workloads, empowering trusted users with secure, frictionless connections to only what they need. Make your attack surface invisible and reduce time to provision by 91% with AppGate SDP, a leader in the 2021 Forrester ZTNA New Wave. Learn more at securityweekly.com/appgate.
Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. Today, we should all browse over to Digitally Imported and fire up a music stream because today is World Techno Day. For those of you who remember Digitally Imported. This is episode 253, recorded on Thursday, December 9th, 2021. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me today is Mr. Tyler Shields. Hello, Tyler. Do you remember Digitally Imported?
I was, as you were bringing up that topic, I was trying to remember. Trust me, I listened to my fair share of EDM back in the day, like old people EDM, and I vaguely remember that name. But was it a channel?
Yeah, it was a whole website with all kinds of different streams. Like they had, drum and bass broken out from house, depending on what flavor, of electronic stuff you like to listen to. They had all sorts of different bit rates, because back then some people were still on modems and broadband was fairly new. So,
Yes.
You didn't just stream music. You had to find a music stream that your internet connection could handle.
Yeah, I definitely remember that. I don't know if I blocked that out of my head or, it kind of is just fuzzy and blurry from that era of my life, but I vaguely remember it.
And what would you stream it with? What Llama-associated application would you use to stream?
Yes, the MP3, the streaming app, the Llama. Oh my God, what was it called?
Winamp.
Winamp. Yes, I remember.
All right. Also joining us today is Katie Tietler. Hello, Katie.
Oh, hello. And no, I do not remember. Nope.
It was a very accurate thing.
I didn't even have my own computer until, I'm not going to say the year. Way later than you guys did.
Fair enough.
Adrian, do you remember the skins for Winamp? You got to do your own skins and everything? Yeah.
And for those of us that really geeked out on skins, we went with a different player called Sonique. And Sonique did not stick to like rectangular skins. It could be circular, a bunch of circles stuck together. Like those skins were crazy.
Yes, and then you had the plug-in visuals that you could add to it as well. But yeah. Okay. Old person stream is now over. Let's get to a real commentary.
All right. One announcement for today. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review these suggestions on a regular basis and we'll reach out to you once they are reviewed. All right, now today's first interview, the topic is XDR. something that here at Security Weekly we've been diving pretty deeply into. Also diving deeply into XDR is our guest today, Allie Mellen, industry analyst at Forrester Research. Allie covers everything SOC related, everything having to do with the people, the processes, the tools of the Security Operations Center. And she's becoming a bit of a regular on our show. And part of that is we appreciate her candid approach that cuts through typical vendor marketing sales fog and tells it like it is. Welcome, Allie.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So this is not as far back as what you guys were talking about, but my first mosh pit was actually at an Infected Mushroom concert. I was very into techno back in the day, and I ended up breaking my ankle. It was so terrible, but really fun.
Story. Like that's pretty legit though. Like that's yeah.
It was a fun time right up until the end.
Things you never thought you'd hear Forrester Analyst actually say.
That's great. Yeah, so diving back into history like that, a common question we'd like to ask people is just how they meandered their way, how they moshed their way into the security industry in the first place. So maybe a few words on that, Allie, before we dive into XDR.
Yeah. So I actually was getting my degree at Boston University in computer engineering. And there was a cybersecurity class, and it was a grad level class. I was really excited to take it, although I didn't know much about it. And I kind of, wasn't sure how that was going to go. But I spent the semester doing some really hands-on stuff. A lot of it was like our midterm, we had to hack a server, similarly, but with more advanced techniques for our final. And we had to do a midterm project. And that project was either doing our own security research or recreating someone else's. And my professor at the time was very obsessed with Black Hat. He thought it was the coolest thing. And so I ended up doing with a couple of my colleagues some research of our own on hacking the square reader. And my professor thought it was so cool. He was like, you need to submit this to Black Hat and just see what happens. And so we did, and it got accepted. And so my first real experience with the security community was flying out to Vegas and presenting to a bunch of hackers on hacking the square reader. And it was such an amazing experience for me. And how can you not do that and just fall in love with security immediately? So from there on out, I was convinced that this was the space for me.
I am deeply jealous. I've been in this industry for 20 years, and I can't say that I've submitted many things to Black Hat, but none of them were accepted. So that's a pretty kick-ass start.
Thank you. Yeah, it was awesome. It was so great. The community was really, really awesome, and I met a lot of cool people. So I kind of got hooked from there.
Yeah, I mean, straight into the deep end. You make a bunch of connections, networking. At security conferences, at least before the pandemic, was definitely the way to kind of jump into the deep end and get going.
Totally. Yeah. I actually took a step back and was working on my engineering consultancy for a few years. But in the back of my head, I was always like, I need to get back into security. And finally was able to.
And we are glad you have. And with that, maybe say a few words about what you've been doing with XDR. And it's interesting because everyone here right now, all the hosts and you, Allie, have all been industry analysts at some point in our careers.
That's
in
awesome.
fact, Tyler was also at Forrester.
Yeah. It's so cool how that happens. There's such a great analyst community. I'm learning, even though I've only been doing this since January, it's been really the whole analyst community, regardless of which organization you're at, which firm you're at, has been really welcoming. So that's been a treat.
And so give us a high-level rundown of the research you've done on XDR, I guess, in terms of, what kind of reports you're putting out and what the goals of those reports were at a high level before we dive into some of the details.
Definitely. So as I mentioned, I started at Forrester in January, and my first real mission was to figure out whether or not XDR was something worth writing about. So I spent 8 months just researching XDR, talking to vendors, talking to end users currently using the offering, talking to industry leaders, everyone that I could who had a perspective on XDR to figure out what it actually was and what it wasn't. And it took me down a lot of rabbit holes, and I ended up publishing the first piece that Forrester has defining XDR from the Forrester point of view, and then also a new tech, which is Forrester's market overview to identify all the different vendors that are playing in this space and how they are broken out based on their lineage. And then also a new wave on XDR, which is that evaluative piece of research that we do. And that had, I believe, 14 different vendors in it, all claiming they had an XDR offering. So the waves are quite a bit of work. The new techs are thankfully a little bit less work in that first piece of research, given that it was also the first piece of research that I ever put out was a lot of interviews and conversations, but those 3 pieces of research gave me a really good understanding of the market and of where offerings are today, and also of what the next couple of years looks like when it comes to XDR.
And I'm just going to key in on something you said there, claims to be XDR, the companies that claim to be doing it. How mature is this particular market, both in terms of maybe the market as a whole, and then the companies in it? Is it too early for customers to get into this market, or are some of the vendors mature enough to dive in?
Yeah, so one of the main differentiations between the Forrester New Wave and the Forrester Wave is the maturity of the market. We typically do new waves on markets that are not mature at all, and that we kind of want to give our end users an idea of what's going on, but not necessarily go all out and do the full scope of a wave that we would on a more mature market, because there are just so many changes happening in the market at that time. So I would say that XDR is fairly immature, even though it's been talked about since around 2018. And there's a massive divide in the vendors who are actually delivering on XDR today and those who aren't. A lot of that comes from 2 different perspectives. You have the SIM and security analytics vendors who are trying to kind of latch onto the buzzword and kind of struggling to explain how their XDR offering is differentiable from their SIM or their security analytics offering. And then you have the EDR vendors who are talking about XDR because all the other EDR vendors are talking about XDR, but they don't seem to have anything that's generally available that would really qualify as anything more than EDR. And then you have that third category that are actually able to deliver on combining telemetry across sources, including endpoint and others.
And you've already touched on it a bit here. I'm just going to one more question, and I'll open it up to Tyler and Katie to ask some questions as well. But you've probably heard at least 24 sales pitches for XDR at this point.
I wish it was only 24. I wish it's been like hundreds. Oh.
Can
sorry,
you
go on.
Us,
I didn't mean to interrupt.
no. Yeah, sorry to trigger.
Pity party.
Yeah. but you're moving on now, at least, right?
Yes, I am.
Give us a sales pitch for XDR. Why would we want to use XDR? Does it replace something we already have? Is it an evolution of something we might already have, or is it something additional? What is the sales? What is XDR, and what's the pitch for it?
Yes. Awesome. So this is the way that I typically explain it to practitioners that I talk to a lot of our clients. So we've had this philosophy that has taken hold of the market for about 20 years. That's the SIM philosophy. This is the idea that we can put a bunch of data in one place and perform analytics on top of it. SIEM vendors take this approach because it gives you the ability to customize the rules you're creating, perform your own analytics on top of it, take in as much data, and ultimately get as much visibility as you actually want. There's a lot of flexibility that comes along with that. And now, given the move to cloud, there's a lot more opportunity for scalability as well. And we've seen the SIEM market evolve to incorporate things like UBA and like SOAR, which has lended itself to addressing more aspects of the incident response lifecycle, and also customizing more aspects of the incident response lifecycle, because that's what SOAR really provides you, is this opportunity to integrate with other tools and to build workflows based on what your specific use cases are. Awesome. Very useful, particularly useful for security teams that are adopting technologies that don't necessarily yet have a security point solution to defend them. So they're able to do this for custom applications, for example. That's a really interesting use case where you don't really have point solutions that are going to defend those effectively. Or before a lot of cloud security products came about, the ability to protect cloud to some extent by bringing in cloud logs into your security analytics platform or your SIEM. Now, there's a different view of the market that has really started to make a splash in the last 10 years or so. And that's the EDR point of view. Now, EDR's point of view on the market is what's most important is to protect where the business data is, which has classically been on the endpoint. And this has really taken hold with incident responders. They really value the telemetry that EDR provides and a lot of the features that EDR has. But inevitably, they still need to bring those EDR alerts and that EDR telemetry into the SIEM anyway, because they need access to other telemetry in the environment from the network, from email, but they just can't get access to it within the EDR product. So that's the first problem, where EDR vendors are like, man, we really wish we could cut out this middleman and not have a dependency on another product. The second is what we all know, the business data isn't really on the endpoint anymore. It's moving to the cloud. And with that shift to the cloud, EDR vendors are facing a bit of an existential crisis because the endpoint is losing its importance and the cloud is gaining importance. And so
you might say they're having a Blockbuster moment, right?
Yes, actually, yeah. I think that they're recognizing it faster than Blockbuster did, unfortunately, RIP, but yeah, absolutely. And so they are recognizing this and making efforts to also protect the cloud and to kind of extend beyond the endpoint. These two factors are what play into EDR vendors moving into XDR, where XDR is really the evolution of endpoint detection and response that's able to incorporate additional telemetry sources to give you the context that you need to be able to take an incident from start to finish within that platform. So it's really about expanding EDR with not only detections from other telemetry sources that the vendor deems are important, but also bringing in context from other telemetry sources as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So you're talking about bringing in telemetry from other sources. When you say telemetry, are you talking about like event data, things that are happening, or structural cyber asset state data, meaning my cloud instance is configured in such a way, or my container is built up in such a way? Is it more structural or more event kind of action data, or is it both?
Yeah, it really depends on it depends on the control point that you're talking about, especially around cloud. We're seeing more, it's that structural side, like I guess you would say around the vulnerabilities and less around the actual threats or attacks that are happening in the environment. But obviously with endpoint, it's more on the event side. And there are a couple of other use cases in there that vendors are exploring, like Microsoft and Trend Micro, on bringing in telemetry from other sources like identity and other aspects.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense given. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Katie. I jumped on you.
I was just going to ask, I know that there are different perspectives in the market about having an XDR, which is one holistic platform, versus the idea of different components from different vendors. And there are pros and cons to either. Do you have a perspective on what XDR actually means in terms of vendor deployment?
Absolutely. So the thing that I found, especially with this new wave, was that the native XDR vendors miles ahead of the hybrid XDR vendors. They have the portfolio and they're really bringing these pieces together effectively. And in contrast, a lot of hybrid XDR offerings currently, or some people call it open. I don't like open. I have a development background, and so it reminds me of open source. But the hybrid perspective is about integrating with other products. And so those vendors are actually not nearly as far along as the native XDR vendors. We see a lot of those offerings being backed by services in kind of a mechanical Turk style situation, which is fine. I think of MDR providers, and I talked to Jeff Pollard, one of my colleagues on the security and risk team, about this quite often. MDR providers are the original ones who were able to deliver on XDR. Now the product vendors are just trying to catch up. But there are very few implementations of hybrid XDR on the market today that are actually completely working with a product as opposed to working with a services backend. Given that, what I've seen so far is the real differentiation on what XDR providers are able to give compared to something like a SIEM is coming from the native XDR side, because the vendor owns all the telemetry that's coming in. They decide what telemetry is coming in and what depth and integration has. And they're able to base their detections on the things that they know are happening in the environment. And so they give you a very structured basis for the detections. And they're also, since this is a SaaS product, building those detections for you over time. Now, the difference here, there's one thing that's worth noting here, is that there's a bit of a nuance between the native XDR vendors and those who are calling it XDR, but are really just using the name as a security analytics layer across their entire portfolio. And you see this particularly with vendors with very large portfolios that are just saying, hey, you can look at all these alerts in one place. That's not really delivering on what XDR is doing with these leading providers who are really building detections based on everything that they know about the environment because they own the whole thing. Hybrid vendors have the opportunity to do this. It's just a little bit more difficult because they have to rely on these partnerships, and they have to choose these partnerships very carefully to maximize the detection quality.
Right. So there are pros and cons, obviously, to either, but it sounds like the companies that you found working best right now have a little bit of a legacy, maybe because they had a head start, maybe because they have the resources already in-house to build it. That's a really good insight.
Yeah, they definitely have a head start, and they definitely have a secret sauce that's working for them, which I found interesting. In all the customer conversations that I've had, they really, for the native XDR vendors, the feedback on the quality of detections was incredibly positive. They basically did not have to worry about the tool. They just let the vendor build these detections, and then any other detections that were more specific to their environment or took into account other sources than what the native XDR offering could provide, they just did in their SIEM.
So it's also less work on the end user / buyer side too, it sounds like.
That's where I think that the importance of this really comes into play, because let's face it, when you're thinking about building detections, you need the talent to do that. So you need a threat intel manager, you need a threat hunter, and you need a detection engineer. The threat hunter and the threat intel manager feed into the detection engineer who's building these detections, et cetera, et cetera. Those three roles are really hard to hire for. They're really expensive, and they're incredibly hard to retain, especially for an internal SOC. vendors are the ones who are able to collect all of that talent because they typically have a lot of startup funding, they make a lot of money, and they're able to offer better compensation, better working hours, potential career path progression that you can't necessarily get in an internal SOC, especially a medium-sized or small one, or one that maybe is large but not structured as well. So that 100% is a factor here too, is taking off some of that skill requirement and putting it back on the vendor without necessarily needing to go so far as adopting an MDR offering, and just having it be a part of the product and part of what the product is delivering on.
Makes sense.
So one of my questions here, one of the things I wonder about is what XDR is potentially going to replace. You've already talked about some of the roles that are hard to hire for, that it can potentially, at least offset, the need for some of those roles. But if somebody hasn't even heard of XDR yet and they're shopping for EDR, should they just stop and be looking at an XDR solution instead? Is EDR just going to become a feature of XDR, or do you see a future for EDR to continue to exist as a standalone product?
Yeah, so this is very good timing because yesterday I released a blog post on an EDR now tech that I just did that I called EDR Mostly Dead, only mostly dead. Because in a previous report, I had referenced EDR as dead, and XDR being its successor, which I still hold is where we're going. But it may have been a bit premature because there is definitely still interest on the client side to have an EDR offering. But a lot of those conversations are turning into a blurry line between EDR and XDR. So XDR 100% replaces EDR in the SOC. And that's a large part of the conversation with end user clients today is they're trying to figure out, should I buy something that's a good XDR now, or should I buy something that's a good EDR now and then grow into XDR later? And it really depends on where you are in your journey, because if you're looking for an EDR offering, I'd highly recommend going with the best EDR offering. That's not necessarily going to be the best XDR offering, and you can tell that by the difference in the previous EDR wave that Forrester released and the XDR new wave that we most recently released. But all EDR vendors are moving towards XDR right now. And that's a part of the reason why I talk about it as EDR is mostly dead, is because the XDR vendors or the EDR vendors are pushing towards XDR, and they're largely accepting that as their future instead of EDR. And so I think that over time, we're going to reach the point where EDR kind of fades away from the picture and is replaced by XDR. And if you don't have any integrations into XDR, then it's just EDR with the XDR name, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I followed really closely was the endpoint market. And right when Next-Gen AV started to come out, things like that, I did a pretty deep dive into the history of endpoint security. And at one point, you'd buy a product just to have a host firewall, before Windows added a firewall, before Mac OS added a firewall into the operating system. Same thing with whole disk encryption. And eventually all these features, got lumped into something we called EPP. And then again, with the second round, when Next-Gen AV came out, when EDR came out, there were a bunch of different separate tools for that. For a long time, the Next-Gen AV folks weren't comfortable saying you can ditch your traditional antivirus or your EPP, but they got there. And a couple of years later, 100%, their marketing is saying, yeah, you can ditch that now. We do all that as well. So I'm just kind of, really curious to see, how things mature here.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's coming from both sides, right? On the one hand, you have EDR vendors who feel like they're getting pulled towards XDR. But on the other side, and one of my colleagues, Chris Sherman, has written about this extensively, you have a lot of features that you associate with EPP that are just being built into the operating system or are being given in some capacity to the end users that are using them. And so it does create this interesting place for EDR vendors and traditional AV vendors, where they are kind of it's like a tug of war, and it's kind of a who's going to win Squid Game style. So I suppose it is particularly interesting. And I think that in the next year, we're going to see a lot of developments in this space that are going to be really compelling as to what the future of endpoint security looks like.
As we start to wrap things up here with the interview, tell us a little bit about what you're moving into now that you've finished up a lot of your XDR coverage here.
Yeah, so I have removed the shackles of XDR, but not actually. I'm still definitely in XDR, but I'm able to kind of look at the SOC more holistically, and I'm really, really thrilled to be able to do that. I just gave a keynote at Forrester Security and Risk Forum on the future of the SOC, and it's a piece of research that I'm so excited about and thrilled to be releasing in Q1 of next year. I'll also be getting into EDR a little bit more. I'm in the process of doing a NowTech on SOAR vendors, so kind of a market overview on SOAR vendors. And I have a lot of research around the state of security operations and of enterprise breaches, very, very data-driven research that I'm just thrilled about. Honestly, I have way too many ideas, but those are just some of the ones that are at least like 85 to 90% of the way written.
Yeah, that's a lot to bite off there. There's so many opinions there on where it's going to go. There's so many people I see experimenting with different models there. And at the same time, the SOC is kind of functioning as, an entry point into our industry. So I think it's really interesting to see what happens with those kind of entry level junior SOC analyst roles.
100%. And I actually am just wrapping up we do these reports at Forrester. They're just job descriptions to describe what the role should look like and try to help CISOs to more easily be able to kind of identify what the skills that they should be looking for are. And I just wrapped up one on a security analyst role. And one of the things that I'm pushing very hard in that research is this idea that this is an entry-level role and we need to treat it as such, and to set expectations a little bit better on what experience is expected, and then build out a development path based on that. I think you're dead on when you say that it is the entry point into a lot of different security functions. And a large part of that research is also, okay, now you have them, and here's what you need to do to grow them into other functions, because this is the start of your pipeline, not the end.
Very exciting stuff, Allie. We'll have to have you back on once you release some of that research and we get a chance to check it out. But thank you for joining us today on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk network visibility with Vincent Burke from Riverbed.